Welcome back to the Homestand Show. Albert Vartanian and James Sharman with me. Joining us now, it's time for Inside the NHL with the pride of Cobourg, Ontario, Chris Johnston of North Star Bets. Chris, thanks for doing this. The Leafs making some noise yesterday, bringing in Jake McCabe and Sam Lafferty from the Chicago Blackhawks. What did you make of the move?
Well, I think it's one that's been in the works for a while. You know, not necessarily surprised that the Leafs are trying to find players that aren't just rentals at this deadline. I mean, those were the kind of guys that they got in Ryan O'Reilly and Noel Acciari previously. But, you know, Kyle Dubas has wanted to try to save his assets to get players that will spend multiple years in Toronto, and that's what he managed to do with both McCabe and Lafferty. I think the real win for the Leafs in this deal is the fact that Chicago ate 50% of McCabe's deal because it turns him into a $2 million defenseman for the next 2 years. And so, you know, we know that the cap is always something the Leafs have to be especially mindful of, like a lot of contending teams. And they've got pretty good defensemen now signed at a nice rate for a couple seasons. So that's why they had to give up a first and second round pick in the deal.
CJ, Dubas says that he's not done yet, that if he can improve the team, he'll still do that, obviously. Looking at the current setup in the forwards, O'Reilly, if he plays on the third line at some point, which is more than likely, then once again, there's a big hole on the left wing on the second line. Is it possible to address that, given the cap situation right now and the assets available to Dubas before the deadline?
I would say anything's possible at this point. I mean, we've seen some pretty high prices paid so far, James, in some of the moves that have happened in recent weeks. But it does seem to be maybe shifting a little more towards a buyer's market. And so a team like Toronto, especially if they can clear out a bit more salary to free up some cap space, I could definitely see them going and making another trade. I think that they've really brought an open mind into this deadline. It wasn't as though they just needed one specific thing or two items. I think that they've tried to survey the entire market of players available and you know, see what makes sense, see what could fit, see where they felt that they could improve. And, you know, look, they still got 3 days until the deadline as we're talking now. And so they've gotten some big business done already, but there's no reason to think that we've heard the last trade from Kyle Dubas and company.
Chris, what are the chances Dubas looks at a goalie before the deadline or even on deadline day?
If he does, he will have had a pretty good poker face. You know, Kyle's been pretty clear that goaltending is not an area he's looking to address. You know, Matt Murray is working his way back from an ankle injury, expected to be activated off long-term injury any day now. You know, Ilya Samsonov has performed well for the Leafs. I think that they like what they have in Joseph Woll down in the American Hockey League. And so, you know, I suppose it's always possible they bring in a veteran sort of number 3 just to you know, give themselves a little bit of extra depth there. But, you know, I haven't heard the Leafs attached to any of the possible candidates. And, you know, certainly the indication from the front office is that they're comfortable with the 2 guys they have.
Now, the lazy narrative with this team for years has been they're too soft in the playoffs, right? We keep hearing that over and over again. So they addressed that, it seems, on the bottom 6 for sure, on the back end. Dubas talking about Lafferty. He says, and then the forecheck, competitiveness, tenacity on the forecheck, and he's able to create turnovers up the ice, be physical, be really competitive. And he said the same thing about Acciari as well. So I look at the bottom 6 right now, CJ, and I see Pierre Engvall sitting there right now. Now, nothing against Pierre Engvall, personally. You know, he's got some skills, no doubt about it. But everything that Dubas spoke about in that sentence is the complete opposite to Pierre Engvall. What is his future, do you think, with this team?
Well, it's very much in question. You know, he's playing on an expiring contract. And, you know, as mentioned, the Leafs do, you know, likely have to make a trade to remove someone from the roster to free up cap space between now and Friday afternoon at 3 p.m. Eastern time. And so, you know, I'd say Pierre Engvall is one of the possibilities to be moved. Another one that might fit the criteria is Alex Kerfoot, you know, who carries a larger cap hit. And so there could be more benefit from removing that just in terms of other moves that could accompany it. But, you know, the best part of what's happened so far, I think, for Sheldon Keefe and the Leafs is that they've added players without removing anyone from the roster. And so, you know, for whether it's a Pierre Engvall or anyone else, there's more competition, even if he does remain with the team beyond the deadline. And so, you know, his minutes certainly aren't guaranteed. When he's at his best, I think the Leafs like him. But you're right, he can be somewhat of a timid player at times or just sort of disappear in games. And so, you know, he's particularly actually struggled in the playoffs too, which is another factor in what the front office is looking at. And so, yeah, he doesn't have a ton of job security right now in Toronto. It's not to say he'll definitely be moved, but you know, he's got to earn his spot.
You know, CJ, the fact that I'm doing Leafs, you know, for me, it's a big deal. Love my Leafs. And the fact that I'm discussing a third line winger means that I feel part of the group now. I feel part of Leaf Nation properly.
I love that. CJ, the prices have been high at the deadline. It seems like the value of a first-round pick is gone. I mean, come the deadline, do you think that'll change?
Well, the only reason it might change is because there's not very many first-round picks left. I mean, by my count, Edmonton is a team that's buying and has one, and I could certainly see them spending it. Carolina still has their first-round pick. Maybe we see them, spend it, but they're kind of a front office that operates differently than a lot of other teams. So that's certainly not a guarantee. St. Louis picked up a couple extra first-rounders with the deals they made for Tarasenko and O'Reilly, and I think they'd like to bring some players in, not just strip down their roster. So yeah, there's a couple more out there, but that's the problem. It's a limited supply this year. You're right. It's been a lot more than what we would typically see. The Leafs have traded 2, Boston traded 1, the Rangers have traded 1 to this point, and perhaps we'll see what they have to give up for Patrick Kane and a deal still to come. The Devils gave up 1 in the Timo Meier deal and potentially 2, depending on some conditions there. So it's certainly been a deadline where I think teams have been, the top teams have been less afraid of they valued their picks a little bit less. And so maybe we'll call that a market correction. It's a very imbalanced league this year, the NHL. 6 of the top 7 teams, as measured by points percentage, are all in the Eastern Conference. And so far, we've seen them all go out and make moves and add players from the West because they, there's pretty hotly contested Eastern Conference side of the bracket right now.
At least we're seeing some futures being traded, some future first rounders from 2026, for example.
Right.
In the past, we haven't seen that so much. There's been very little creativity from GMs in the NHL compared to, say, the NBA, where we're seeing all these really creative methods to find ways to get players on their team. Now, I know they're shackled by the CBA to a certain degree, but do you see the future of the NHL being a bit more fun this time of year, finding ways to get deals done as opposed to the typical way?
Well, that's been a story for me of what we've seen in the last 3 weeks. I think it has been fun. We've seen a number of impactful players move, which isn't always the case. It's not all just 6th and 7th defensemen going for late round draft picks, which, is some deadline periods. If we're being honest, that's a lot of what we get. And, I think that probably the story for me of this deadline period has been, we knew that no one has cap space. I mean, the NHL's hard cap league, it's only gone up by $1 million the last couple seasons because of the pandemic. So essentially everything has been frozen, and we've seen almost no trade activity during the season until the calendar flipped to February. Well, lo and behold, all these top teams with serious cap related, constrictions have found a way around it. The Leafs have added 4 players and have been at the ceiling all year long. Even, Tampa found a way to make a move. Boston, which was near the top of the salary cap, still found a way to make a move. And so, yeah, the GMs have been creative, I think, certainly far more than we're accustomed to seeing. I hope we see more of it. I'm certainly a proponent that I'd like to see a little bit more risk taken from NHL front offices. I think we have to remember this is an entertainment sport. We have to remember that fans like to see and discuss, player movement. I think it's good all around for the game. And so, yeah, I hope we see more of it. And of course, we're going to get a rising salary cap at some point, whether it's next year or 2 years down the road. And that's going to help, I think, free up things for more transactions too.
CJ, just back on the Leafs quickly. Matthew Knies, have you heard any noise in terms of what they expect to do with him once the college season is over?
Well, I'd be surprised if we didn't see him signing his entry-level contract when the college season is done. Now, he plays at the University of Minnesota, one of the top teams in the NCAA. And so they could potentially play almost right till the end of March, depending on how they fare in the playoffs. And by the time Matthew Knies can sign his entry-level deal, there may only be a handful of games left in the NHL's regular season. But, given that there was serious, discussion last year when his year ended in the NCAA between the Leafs and his camp about bringing him in then, I'd be surprised if he opted to return to Minnesota for another season. And so, at that point in time, the ELC can be hammered out pretty quickly. It's, it's pretty clear. It's not a lot of haggling, I guess, done over those type of contracts. And then, I think we'll see him play NHL games in this regular season. And depending on how he plays, how he looks, how he fits, he might even be playing for the Leafs in the playoffs. That's dependent too on what else they do between now and the deadline. But I think any moves the Leafs make between now and Friday at 3 p.m. Eastern will be done with keeping in mind that they have to keep space to sign Matthew Knies.
We saw Puljujärvi get traded just a few hours ago now. Obviously not a huge name. There are some big names, though, on most trade boards right now. Patrick Kane being the biggest one. Is it going to happen tomorrow? I think you reported Wednesday being one of the days that by that point the cap situation is very favorable for the Rangers. Is that going to happen?
Yeah, it's a matter of time, and we don't have the precise timing nailed down right now. But what I can say is that if the trade happens after 5 p.m. Eastern time on Tuesday, that still counts as Wednesday for cap purposes. The league, does business that day. So perhaps it's Tuesday night, perhaps it's Wednesday night. I mean, here's what I know. The deadline is Friday afternoon, and I would be surprised, very surprised, if Patrick Kane wasn't a member of the New York Rangers by that point in time. It sounds as though everything's basically been lined up. We've received no formal indication that he's waived his no movement clause, but based on the amount of cap maneuvering the Rangers have done in the last 4 days, waiving players, sending out Vitaly Kravtsov, essentially for nothing, just to get him off the roster so they could accrue more space. That they dressed 2 players in a game on Sunday night that they didn't play at all. They just sat them on the bench. The Rangers are clearly acting as though that this will be done. And my understanding too is that they have a third-party team lined up that will take an extra 25% of Kane's deal. And so there's been a lot of number crunching that needed to be done for this to work. And now it's a couple days later, and we just wait for essentially everything to be signed off on. But I haven't heard any reason to believe that deal isn't going to happen.
And the Minnesota Wild, one of the teams that seem to be taking on a lot of salary, the third player in a lot of these deals. Obviously, a lot of movement in the East, all the powers in the East. But in the West, it seems like everyone's kind of standing still. Do you expect any movement from them?
Well, I look at Edmonton in particular as a team that has to make some kind of move here. They've really aggressively been scouting and looking at the defensive market. They went well down the road on Monday in trade talks with Arizona on Jacob Chychrun. They've checked in on Matthias Ekholm in Nashville. I think they've had their tabs on Joel Edmondson in Montreal for much of the season, but it sounds like those talks have been fresh. Even Colton Parayko of the St. Louis Blues, who's an Alberta boy, has been at least, on the radar for the Edmonton Oilers. So I think when all is said and done, that's a team that I look at to make a big move. Some others maybe that haven't received as much attention, the Los Angeles Kings, having a great year. I think that they'd like to add to their blue line, perhaps even another goaltender, because if they have had one Achilles heel this year is just too many pucks going in the net. The Colorado Avalanche, the defending Cup champs, were aggressive at last year's deadline. As a result, they don't maybe have as many picks and things to deal as they would like, but they certainly have a lot of cap space with a couple injured players on long-term injured reserve. So I think Chris McFarland, their general manager, will be, a little bit more active in the days ahead than he has been. And, I still wonder about Winnipeg. The Jets made a deal last weekend to get Nino Niederreiter from Nashville, but they've got a lot of cap space. They've had an interesting season. I know they've been skidding a little bit of late. I think that Kevin Cheveldayoff probably has another card up his sleeve to play too. And so, maybe the East will dominate the headlines in the first part of this deadline, but the West will come on a little stronger, closer to the final, minutes and hours.
CJO, very quickly here, switching gears. Outside of Ryan Reynolds and Rob McElhaney, the biggest celebrity fan of Wrexham FC in Wales is, of course, yourself, Chris Johnston.
Thank you.
How many shirts do you own, and when are you getting the tattoo?
No tattoos for me, man. But I'm not even ashamed to admit I watched the documentary and kind of got it in my blood, and it was cool to see them play a couple games that I could get easily here over the traditional television, watching Wrexham. And so my dad and I have both been following them and text about the games on the weekends and that. So yeah, it's been fun. When you grow up here, I didn't have an attachment to any sort of soccer team in Europe, and that's always been an impediment for me. To kind of maybe getting more engaged with the sport. So I'm starting way low down, and I'll still be here when we get to the Premiership in 10 years' time.
I love that. We get to the Premier League. I love it.
He's right in. Now, Wrexham's supposed to play a preseason friendly against Manchester United and Chelsea, Chris. So maybe you can make out to that in the summer.
I'd love that. I'd love to go see the ground too. So, new bucket list items for me as well.
I love that. Thank you, Chris, so much for doing this. It's Chris Johnston of North Star Bets.